This is a Power 98.7 podcast. Now we're talking. Subscribe to Power 98.7 podcasts in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. There's more on power987.co.za. Tech Tuesday.
We've got 14 minutes after 2 o'clock. It is a Tech Tuesday. And today on Tech Tuesday, we're talking a little bit about coding. We're going to go into it and the depth of it and understanding it and unpacking it. We've got joining us the CEO of We Think Code, Nyari Samushonga, joining us, which is, of course, a We Think Code, a South African tech academy that operates in Johannesburg, Durban, and Cape Town. And we're going to be looking at exactly some of those opportunities that they've got in store for people. And also, where are we when it comes to the inclusivity of this tech revolution? Nyari, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Welcome to Power Lunch.
Thank you, Faith. I'm really excited to be here. And hello to your listeners.
Thank you very much. You know, it certainly was a buzzword. I think it was about maybe 5-6 years ago or so, when we were talking about coding, when it was making its ways and its rounds through. But we never entirely harnessed it. It's been developing over time. And now we're looking at spaces where we can use this and say it's inclusive. But maybe let's start off from the beginning, Nyari, around the coding revolution, so as it were, which was brought about by the 4IR revolution. But I remember when a specific time in history when coding as a concept was huge. Talk to us a little bit about where did it come about and how did it come about?
Well, I think what you're seeing is the trend of the world just becoming more digital. And so we're shifting from a place where, you know, when you use an app or when you pick up your phone and you're doing something, you just think of yourself as a consumer. Someone is going to make the app and I'll be a user. Where coders are really the people that come and make those apps, you know, build that website for you. When you think about tapping with your Apple Pay on your phone to, instead of pulling out a credit card, someone is actually making that software that connects you to your bank account, takes out that money and sends you the notification without having to write a check anymore. And so essentially that's what coding is about. And as the world becomes more digital, we are needing more people that can make these digital tools for us. And Africa is really stepping up and saying, we want a seat at that table. We want to be makers of tech, not just users.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about how do we become makers of tech and not just users, because oftentimes, and before, as I said, it is about 6 or so years, maybe you can even say it's about 10 years ago or so, when the revolution of coding started. And of course, we started seeing it a lot in America and in Europe and the like, and that was being used specifically even with children. Children were then able to code. Right now, we use the MIT Scratch and the like, but the software and website development was almost misconstrued to be the job of that person that is weird, that nerd that is weird, that's sitting in the corner and in the basement of his mother's house and is making up websites. We never actually thought about it from a place of coding, the back end operations of even the websites that we see.
You know, what's so fascinating is that in the beginning, coding was considered women's work. You wouldn't believe it, Faith. And so women were actually at the forefront of coding. And then, you know, as with many things, they were gradually pushed out. So back in the day, you go back to the 1800s and you've got people like Ada Lovelace, who are famous as, you know, one of the first computer programmers. And then you move beyond that, and when computers were these gigantic things the size of a stadium, and you were coding by punching in cards like a time card, actually, women were the ones who were predominantly doing this work.
Yeah. Was they doing it at NASA as well?
Yes.
Yeah, they were. They were doing it at NASA as well, and they were putting in those little codes and punching in the codes that allowed for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That movie with Octavia Spencer,
100%.
Black women at NASA doing the most. That was women in coding, and over time, like with many things, the space gets contentious. There's an active intention of exclusion, and then it becomes stereotyped as a domain for men, for white men in particular, and white men who have that awkward personality, who are super geeks. So if you're not like in the top, 0.001% of intellect, you can't do it. So this drive you're describing, this energy around coding, is really the rest of us reclaiming the space and saying democratize it. We all have ideas, we all have innovations, and with today's technology, we can all create software to solve our own problems.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an exciting time to be involved in tech.
Absolutely. I mean, you're speaking about the movie, and I'm going to actually implore you, fam, if you've never checked out the movie, it's called Hidden Figures. I remember it now. It's a Hidden Figures, and it basically just details how these women were able to code and help out at NASA. And it's so profound that you actually refer us to the historical context of coding, Nyari, because a lot of this stuff is misconstrued to be a very male-dominated space or a very male-centric space. They'll even use something like neurological explanations to do it and say, no, usually it's because men use the logical side of the brain, the left side of the brain, and then women use the right side of the brain, so they are the more creative ones. That's why you find them succeeding in the areas of creativity as opposed to men, which are then succeeding in the area of coding and all these mathematical kind of jobs, which is not true.
It really isn't. I mean, you've seen, for example, with this COVID pandemic, right? Even with science, you've seen how women in South Africa, virologists, are stepping up. And we're starting to see that the ideas are everywhere. It's really a question of opportunity and of training. It's not about anything inherent, that on day one when you're born, Faith will be this, and Nyari will be that, and the man will be that. It's more about we're all complex beings with a lot of potential in us. And the truth is, structurally, the opportunities we get in many ways shape where we end up. And so a lot of professions, think of law. There was a time when all the judges, all the lawyers were men, accounting, law, medicine, and so forth. And we start to take it for granted when those professions become inclusive. But for some reason, there's this cognitive dissonance. And we still hold to a view that fields that are currently male-dominated are only for men. But in truth, women are just as capable as men are, and they are showing their hand in the space of computer programming, in artificial intelligence, and they're making it clear that this fourth industrial revolution is not just about the computers. It's actually about the people who make these computers and who program them to do things. And we need inclusion there.
Yeah. As you're speaking about it, many people are truly removed from the application of code. Where we keep speaking about it from a conceptual rhetoric, right? Coding. We even say we're going to introduce it within our basic education system. We even say now we're going to introduce robotics. But do we ever teach people, and do we ever expound on the application of code, on what has got code, on how code applies to everyday living?
It's interesting you say that, because this is a lesson that, you would think for me as a woman working within the tech space, exactly what you're describing would be obvious to me, that we're not explaining, we're speaking past each other. But, within the We Think Code frame, We Think Code is an academy that's about inclusion, about getting everyone who might have an interest in this space to understand their potential in it and have an opportunity to actually work at it. But we were struggling to get gender parity within our academy. As recently as 2020, 16% of the students on a We Think Code campus were women, and the rest were men. And we were not getting as many applications from women to join the academy. When women came in, they were dropping out disproportionately. And when we asked ourselves why, and not just like a casual making excuses, life is tough, why, but really started to look at the data to try and understand what was going on, we realized that when young women were hearing about code, be a programmer, either one, they didn't actually think of what does that mean, so they didn't try, or they heard it and they thought it's for men. So we changed our language and started talking about, do you want to create? Are you a problem solver? Are you analytical? Are you detail-oriented? Because that's what coding is about, right? It's about looking at a set of patterns and using logic to say that if I talk to the computer in this language, of which, look at South Africa, how many people speak how many languages each? So coding is just a language, and it's a language that you use to speak to the computer, and then you use it to solve problems. So if you're a problem solver, you could be a coder. And so when you start to speak like that, you engage everybody and you make them understand what you're talking about. Not like, kind of at that 38,000 feet in the sky, programming, coding. That's what allows it to perpetuate as a domain for only a select, unique group of people and leaves everyone else out.
I love what you're speaking about when you say the language that we use in being able to speak to some of these subject matters. Maybe that is becoming what is intimidating. You know, we know that even from a basic education perspective, a lot of the people that do languages are women. Right? The women are the ones that enjoy languages, just like the women are the ones that enjoy things like history, right? Because it's a historical context, it's a context, and it also understands the framework of language. A lot of the women understand English and the second language teachings, whether it's Afrikaans, Sesotho, Zulu, and the like. But coding is just like taking English, Sesotho, or Tswana. It's just it's just a language that is applied on this hardware format.
That's it exactly. You know, in a past life, I was an accountant, Faith, and I often say to people, when finance people are using these big words that no one understands, like, is the economy crashing? Are we all going to be on the street tomorrow? There are ways you can speak about something that's accessible. I can talk to you about your balance sheet, and then suddenly, like, oh my goodness, I'm in accounting class. Or I can talk to you about what you have versus what you owe. And suddenly that's something that you can access. And it's a similar thing within the tech space that, yes, by the time you are very proficient and you're building an application like Netflix that's allowing people to live stream around the world, you need to be quite expert. But at the entry point, if we just talk to you about there is a computer, and the computer speaks in a particular language, and it understands instructions in a particular language, and it's strict. So if you mix up your words or get your grammar wrong, the computer can't do what you told it, then suddenly anyone understands that. And so they stay interested, and you're like, now here, try. And you talked about Scratch, the game from MIT that is used usually with young kids to teach them to code. That's the other thing. We're putting computers in schools, and we're teaching our kids Microsoft 365. That's not the creative stuff. There are all these things that are available for free that allow people to understand. It's like, it's puzzles, it's building blocks, it's communicating in the language of a computer.
As you're speaking about puzzles, I know that a lot of times even electrical vehicles were used, especially when it comes to children, to teach them the formatting of coding. But we as citizens, and I'm sure you can speak to this even more, we as people have been coding way before coding was even a language form that was popular, right? You were making reference to puzzles. What is this thing called? Lego.
Yes.
To be able to go A plus this equals to this. Yes. That's a form of code. Yes. Puzzle building is a form of code. You are building the problem and you're solving the problem. But are we able to then enhance, because it speaks significantly to the application of it, are we then able to enhance and go, hold on a second, we've been developing and training our brains for so many years to actually code through puzzles, through Scrabble, through Lego building and the like.
And this is the thing, right? Because anyone who's amazing at anything started somewhere. And the question is, at that starting point, is the effort made to engage you and to get you to understand it, right? No one was born a lawyer, no one was born a surgeon, no one was born an accountant. But if you sit there and you diligently work at it, then you can become better. And the sooner you're exposed to it as a young person, the less intimidating it is. You know, I'm an African girl through and through. I remember some years ago, I was in Salt Lake City, which is a really cold part of the United States. And of course, because I was there and I'm an adventurer, I decided to go skiing. So I'm on these tiny, tiny slopes. They're not steep at all. And I'm on my butt most of the time. And I'm watching these 4 or 5-year-olds, just skiing without fear. And I think that's the thing about exposing young people to things. They don't yet have a lot of the insecurities and hang-ups that grown-ups accumulate that stop them from trying new things. And so if we start to bring coding into a space where people are really young, you demystify it and you take away that intimidation factor. So they can play with it, they can enjoy it, it becomes familiar. And as they get older, the confidence is there, the proficiency is there. And, that's how you put Africa on the map as a creator of tech and not just a consumer. Because we have the innovation capacity, we have the creativity. What we're not giving our youth is the opportunity to play. And from play, create important work. And I think that's really the journey.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about how can the technology that we have translate to real life job creation. You cannot have 77% of young people that are sitting unemployed, and we've got technology and technology platforms that are actually freely available if we only knew access of it, that can allow us to actually further our and expand our knowledge base and hopefully be able to be that mode of creating jobs. But if I were to ask you, Nyari, from the top of your head, we've got about 30 seconds before the news, and you can expound also after the news around what kind of items, give us everyday items, just so that we're able to understand what items actually have codes. Besides your computers and your laptops, what actually has got codes?
Think about it, it's everywhere. When you start your car and it switches on and it's telling you the temperature outside, it's telling you the range of how far the petrol is going to take you. That's a software program that's sitting right there. If you think about basically every single app that you use, when you pick up your phone, everything you're doing on your phone is being driven by software in the back. Your calculator has software in it that's programmed to give you the solutions when you punch in an answer.
Hold it, Nyari. We're going to continue. What actually has got codes? Because when we understand what has got codes, we'll see exactly how applicable is coding. And more importantly, how can jobs be created through coding? That and more coming up next. Right now it's 2:30. Let's get your latest in Power News.
Call Faith on 0861 987 000.
Yes, indeed. That is the number to dial. It's 21 minutes to go before the top of the hour. We're in conversation with Nyari Samushonga, who is the CEO of We Think Code. We're unpacking this notion and concept of coding. How does it work? When does it work? When does it apply? What applies coding? And more importantly, how can coding actually be used as a tool for job creation? Where is it that young people can benefit and upskill themselves so that they are able to get access to opportunities that are out there? Nyari is still unpacking for us as we go into this part of the conversation. If you've got questions for her or questions around just the technology and the revolution of it and how coding applies, 0861 987 000. Or how do you upskill yourself more than anything else? Nyari, we were just talking to us about what actually has got code.
It's essentially everything at this stage, right? So anything you're using that's digital, when you're looking at a screen that's digital and it's giving you information, your calculator has got code. That's what it's using in the background to take the numbers you're giving it and give you an answer. When you're using your computer, whether you're using Microsoft Word, if you're watching movies, when you're live streaming, Netflix is actually using software to house these videos and beam them out into your computer or onto your phone. So essentially everything we're touching now, but there are more interesting applications. What computers are really good at is gathering a lot of data, searching through it quickly, and computing fast. And when you think of it that way, think of things like medical diagnostics. You know, when you go to the doctor and you give them a set of facts and you're like, well, if someone is presenting with this combination of symptoms, what could be wrong with them? And what they're using now is some, great software technology to go in the back and check through historically people who have presented with this have ended up with this problem, and they're getting you diagnosis quicker. So it's essentially this incredibly powerful tool for gathering data, analyzing data, running computations, and using information to project into the future. But it also creates fun things like games, which is actually one of the main ways that people get into code, is they start out by playing a lot of games digitally.
Just around how a person actually starts. Maybe let's start there. How does one actually start coding? Because as I said, coding is a language that we're learning now. For in the South African context. In other countries, it's been happening for 10, 12 years or so, right? But South Africa is adopting it, so as it were. We are probably the late adopters into this revolution. But talk to us a little bit about, how do we start coding? Where do I start? If I say I want to learn this thing, where do I start? Do I actually need a computer to code? How do I actually start this notion of coding? Where does it all start?
The ideal is to definitely start on a computer, right? Because essentially it's a method of instructing the computer. And then the method of instructing the computer is with the language of the computer. And so we speak of programming languages. You might have heard of things like Java or Python, which are examples of these languages. And a good place to start is what you described, which is Scratch. Because what it does is it makes you aware of how there are certain building blocks that you bring together and the computer does what you asked. So with Scratch, for example, you could be creating animations. Maybe people can think of PowerPoint. You know, with PowerPoint, how you can have a number of pictures or things that you've got on the screen that you want to put photos on a PowerPoint presentation, and you use that animation thing and you tell it, show the pictures one after the other, a second apart. So that's similar to how programming works, which is you set a set of instructions that should do something. And things like Scratch enable you to do that. But there are a lot of other online tools like Codecademy, which you can use online that start you from zero as a beginner, and you can gradually start to learn how to use it and get better. And what I think is, when you look at maybe 100 years ago, me and my obsession with history, reading wasn't something for everyone, right? It was the high scribes and the clergy were the only ones that could read. And then when things needed to be documented, the scribes were the ones that wrote it down. And when things needed to be pulled from history, the scribes read it. We're getting to a point with code where it's so ubiquitous. When you think of finance, when you think of education, you know, when you think of, like I was saying just now, in medicine, even in agriculture, we're using a lot of code for all of these things. And so we're getting to a point where regardless of what work you do, you're working with a computer somehow. And so being able to understand the language of computers, even a little bit, is very useful. In the same way that some people are writers, but not everybody needs to be a writer to know the importance of reading. And so that's where we're getting to now with code.
Yeah. So you would need the let's you and I make something up so that we can make this as practical as possible, ne? Let's say that it's not the big revolution right now, but in some households they've got it. You know, the robotic what are the brooms? You know, those little things that move around and they clean, those robotics, automatic.
Oh, the ones that you instruct and then they find a route through your house. Yes.
Yeah, so they move around and they clean for you. They pick up the dust for you. There's little. I don't know if you've seen them, but they're like little robots that go around and they clean.
I know the ones.
Yeah, they clean in your house, and it saves you. Supposed to save you time, right?
Right.
That in itself has got some kind of code that is telling it what to do.
Right.
Okay, so a person would say to you, okay, then Nyari, let's say using the case of the automatic broom that is able, or the robotic broom that is able to sweep for itself. What goes in it? Is it what hardware? Would it be the hardware that goes in it? And then how do I program it to do what I want it to do? Do I program it on the computer? How does it work?
Okay, so it's got a combination of your hardware and your software. So obviously your hardware is the actual little vacuum, right?
Yeah.
Which is going to have the same things that the manual vacuum has. The difference is that instead of you pressing a button to switch it on so that it goes from quiet to that noisy sound of a vacuum cleaner, it will probably have, you'd give it, the code would tell it the time. So you would instruct your little vacuum that at 8 every morning, you turn on. So it would turn on. So the first piece of code there is some kind of a timer inside it that has a clock that's aware of the time, and then at the time it comes on. Very similar to your alarm. You know how you set your alarm before you go to bed? You're essentially coding your phone to at 6 in the morning make an annoying sound that disturbs your slumber. You're doing the same thing with that little vacuum. The next thing it needs is the ability to now actually move. So now it's switched on, it's 8 a.m., it's got to move. So you've got code in there that tells it to go in a straight line, for example. So the code is going to instruct it, just keep going straight. The hardware probably has a sensor that can sense that there's an object in front. You know, similar to how an electric gate, when you stand in front of it, stops moving so that it doesn't bump into you. So there's hardware in there that has a sensor. So the sensor can see that there's an obstruction in front. And you've got code that says, okay, if you observe an object in front of you, turn to the right. So that would be code that you write that tells it when it observes a hazard or an obstruction, it must turn. So it'll turn. And then when it turns, it goes back to that default state, which says go straight. And it starts moving straight. And the code tells it, this time, if you bump into an obstruction from the sensor, go left. So it's essentially, in there, the code is telling the device to move, and then it's making decisions. So when you move and you encounter an obstacle, what do? Stop moving in that direction, turn in a particular direction, and then move again. And then when you move, continue to move until you encounter another obstacle. And then you might have a map instead, like a maze. We were talking about puzzles earlier. You might program it to say, okay, here, I'm giving you a picture of this maze. and you give it all the instructions up front. So rather than relying on bumping into an object, it knows it should move forward for 2 meters, then stop and turn left, and move forward for 5 meters, then stop and turn right. So maybe it's come out of your living room, gone down the corridor, and it's turned into your bedroom. So that's essentially what you're doing there. Is there a map, a physical map, which is an old thing we all know, is put into the computer, and the computer is instructed to go on a very particular route through that map. So the coding is that point of instructing the vacuum to go a particular way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. When we're looking, and it's great to use the automatic broom, because that in itself is a code. In order for it to move in the different ways that you've described, that would require you to actually show how coding is actually practically applicable. But just around how right now with the unemployment rate, and a lot of young people are feeling as though they're just not enough jobs. And let's be real, right? They aren't. And South Africa needs to get back to a place where it can actually become, the champion economy, but it's not there yet. How can the techs of, for example, coding and learning how to code actually speak to answering the very same unemployment crisis that we're facing, especially amongst the youth?
And I think if I can piggyback off of literally the example we just used of that vacuum, the reality is that in order for that vacuum to work, there's now a need for someone to code and to instruct that vacuum to move a particular way. And so what we're seeing is that while the increase in computer technology is taking away certain jobs, it at the same time is creating these jobs. It's creating those jobs for coders. It's creating the jobs for the makers of these physical devices that interact with code. And so software actually right now is one of the few areas in the world that has a shortage of skills. And the tragedy is South Africa sits at the same time with this high shortage of skills in technology. LinkedIn estimates about 40,000 junior software development jobs are unfilled each year in South Africa. Jobs that go where no one can take the job because the skills are not there. But we're only graduating 2,900 software developers every year. And so there's a huge opportunity for us there. And we need to move away from this idea that we're going to train all of our software developers in universities. Yes, absolutely, many of them will be. But the reality is the size of the need and the size of the pipeline that's producing the skills don't match. And how we close that gap is exactly what you're describing. Is how does a single person empower themselves to go and learn to code? And if you go online, there are things like codecademy.com, which I just described, where for free you can start to learn the beginner lessons, the foundations of software programming. And they take you step by step from knowing nothing. Organizations like We Think Code are doing the same thing. We recruit people that have never coded before, train them over 2 years, and then pathway them to employment. And similarly, there are other programs. There's Capacity, Umuzi, Codex that are doing similar work. So the key thing is for, first of all, South Africans to become aware of this as an opportunity and then start looking online. Just Google coding classes, coding academy, coding lessons. And you might be able to find some online, and then you might actually be able to join a program that, sponsors your education and trains you to it. But the truth is, when we went into COVID, into lockdown, and everyone was working remotely, that was more and more and more tech that needed to be created. And that meant more opportunities for coders. So this is definitely a world where people should be looking at as an opportunity to build a career.
Yeah. It's also around the free platforms to be able to do so, because again it speaks to a lot of times the intimidation. I think maybe even, and you can speak to that as well, is that a lot of people suffer from the intimidation complex, right? Some feel as though, I've studied one thing all my life, and now to make a pivot in the industry so that I can get myself a job or upskill myself just seems like something that is a daunting task or a difficult one to understand. Speak a little bit about the intimidation factor that gets put into this, and especially around the intimidation factor where young women are concerned. I feel like sometimes young women feel as though they don't deserve to learn how to code, or they don't have the skills to learn how to code. And yet you're saying that even the history of coding, it lies with black women.
Yes. I would say, I'll use myself as the first example. I was an accountant for 11 years before I switched careers. And it's definitely intimidating as a person, in my case, who's like educated and has become a professional. And then now you say, okay, I'm going to do something new. So you arrive on day one and you go from being one of the most informed people in the room to being one of the least knowledgeable people in the room. But guess what happens when you persevere with it? Then you're able to bring these two things together that actually make you unique. And you describe the thing with the young women. You know what makes it harder, Faith, is when everyone tells you you shouldn't be doing something. When you start doing it and it's hard, those voices get louder in your head because you're like, they were right. I should never have tried this. I should have stayed in my place. But the reality is that you've got to be brave enough to be bad at something new. Because if you're not, you close in your own barriers. And the truth is there are women that are doing amazing things within the tech sector. And you won't see them unless you step into this world and start to try to do it yourself. There's this particular woman, Jennifer DeVos, who was like a fine artist for a very long time. And then she switched and she's one of the top women in tech. She built 180 websites in 180 days in an effort to teach herself to code. And so I think what we need to do is, it's not just with the women, like with every societal issue that affects women, we all need to come together and start to respect that code is about solving problems. Yeah. And if we want to solve all the problems, we need to have different kinds of people in the problem-solving room, whether they're women, whether they're from rural environments, from urban environments, etc. And it is learnable. If I could start at 30, then I think anyone can start. Definitely the younger women can start. And like that example I gave about skiing and the fearlessness of young kids, we need to start putting it in our primary schools and not making kids play with Office 365, but with games like Scratch that teach them about coding. So I would say just start. It's actually not that hard. It's not just for math geeks. It's actually for people who are analytical, problem solving, pay attention to detail. And that's so many people in so many other professions. So just give it a try. Go online and play with it.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking about that, just building puzzles.
Yeah.
Because we've been doing it for a long time. It's just build a puzzle, if you want to even start from scratch, so as it were. Big Betty saying that, Faith, an interesting topic right there. I worked in the tourism industry from 2010 until we were hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. I studied Java development online during lockdown. Wow. And I passed all my yes. If anybody knows how Java is, how difficult Java it is to pass, they'll tell you. And passed all my modules from Unix. I got the job as a Java developer in July 2021. I'm going to go to the phone lines. Let's go to Mpo in Rustenburg. Hi, Mpo.
Hi, Faith. Thanks for taking my call, and hi to your guest as well.
Absolute pleasure. Go ahead, sir.
I just wanted to say that the impact of technology, I've seen them in the mining industry as well. And I think it's mostly about the people of the country in general don't like innovation very much because they feel threatened that it takes away their job. And this is in light of, for example, I'm in the mining industry and safety is number one priority.
Mm-hmm.
The primary goal is to have no fatalities. However, we saw in Australia where they have a mine with no one underground, but it's fully operational. Mm-hmm. Only machines are working underneath there. But when this was aired as just a passing by comment here in South Africa during a council at the Chamber of Mines, it was shut down immediately because of the threat to jobs that could bring, even though the primary goal is to have zero fatalities because people would be underground. So I think once people start realizing that the future does not have time for labor-intensive work, then the people in the country will start realizing that technology is our friend. Just as much as language helps us communicate, technology helps us become more efficient. And I really hope South Africans are listening to this conversation that you're having and realizing that technology is not a threat. It's something you use to better yourself as well.
I love that. And you're speaking so significantly about what's happening within the sector of industries. Nyari, you'll be able to speak to this. I look at the finance industry, right? The financial institutions, whether you like it or not, it just takes somebody to go into a bank. If you remember how a bank was pre-COVID-19 or even 2018 for that matter, and you compare a bank now, you will see that the staff that were working there back then, they're not even there anymore. You've got about 3 bank tellers or so. The banks are small. They're becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So whether we like it or not, whether we choose to jump on the bandwagon or not, it doesn't mean that these big companies are not going to apply the tech. They're not going to then say, you don't have the skill that speaks to it, and actually let people go. And oftentimes they're letting people go silently.
It definitely is the truth, and I understand that there's the issue of the fear. But then the way out of the fear is, we're not going to stop this train. Technology is not going to stop coming. The question is, are we prepared for the moment? Because I think it creates more opportunity than what it takes away. The challenge is that if we don't get the education right, if we're not looking at it now and saying, so rather than training people to then be in labor-intensive work and repetitive work, let's train them to be in a knowledge economy, then that means when that moment arrives, they're not ready. And we strip away jobs and livelihoods instead of proactively creating them through people who are trained for a digital economy. And I think it really rests in education so that the next 10, 20-year wave prepares us to be working in a knowledge economy. And so I really agree with the caller who's saying it's about looking at it and moving forward as opposed to trying to cling to a reality that's already gone away.
So give us some tips before we let you go, Nyari. Where can I go to learn this new skill? And can I be old? Can I be young? How do I start with it? Just some of the platforms that are available to learn the skill.
I think the message you shared with us, that gave me goosebumps. So I would say go online, look for free coding classes. Codecademy is an example of one that does that. Udemy has some courses. Some of them are free, some of them are paid for. And then start. A good language to start with is Python. Why? Because it reads a lot like English. So it's easy to understand. So it's an easy one to learn because it's not too big a shift. And then the next thing is persevere with it. Remember, anything you're good at today, there was a point when it was new and scary. And then finally, a lot of us have crossed this boundary line, and we can tell you from the other side that it's doable, not because we are different, but because we tried. So I encourage everyone to get into tech.
Oh, love his stuff. Nyari Samushonga, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, the CEO of We Think Code. It really is just that, isn't it? We have to be able to become practical in some of the conversations that we're having. We cannot keep talking about unemployment. We cannot keep talking about the skills deficit if we're not going to show you how to get there, how to pivot. And maybe you are that person that's thinking, shucks, man, COVID-19 has done a number on me. I no longer feel relevant in the job, or I'm really rethinking the job that I've been doing. How about you just try tech? Try it. Just try code and see how far it takes you. And even MIT Scratch, I love it because it teaches you from a kid's perspective. I like anything that makes sense to kids. But just try it. Who knows? It might just work for you.
You've been listening to a Power 98.7 podcast. For more podcasts, visit power987.co.za or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.